All right, me. It is the next day, and I will admit that I am wearing the same clothes because I'm an animal. But this morning, I finished reading Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. This specific version that I read is the 60th anniversary version, which was published in 2013, I do believe. Fahrenheit 451 is interesting in terms of like copyright publication because there's actually an initial story written by Ray Bradbury, and Bradbury did this a lot, of where a smaller portion or a section of a sort of short story would get published somewhere, and then it would be expanded upon later, right? So there's a shorter story called The Fireman, which was published in 1951, and then the full book Fahrenheit 451 was published in 1953, I do believe, right? So there's a 2-year gap. But 451 itself, right? This is one where another book that I think the general American population is very familiar with and is aware of, but it just goes, book burning is bad and we should have information, right? Without seeing the whole, or at least the larger picture of things, right? And it's one of those things of where the way that American English and literature classes in America are taught often lead to this, right? Of where, because of the way that we're asked to do things as teachers, then inherently becomes, disinteresting to students, right? And so we read something like Fahrenheit 51, which is this really, really powerful and emotional book, both about knowledge, but also about how do we interact with the world around us, and how do we trust what is being given to us, and why do we trust it, right? Versus what I think has become kind of the general imagination of what this book is, which is book burning is bad, right? So that's that. Story-wise, right, we follow Guy Montag, who I read the entire time as Montague, which is, I think, fair. I don't know if that's an actual literary reference that Bradbury intended, but he is what's referred to as a fireman, because what has happened at this point in society development is that houses are now fireproof, right? But now we need to limit information, which we discover why a little bit later. And so the fireman goes from being this thing of where they put out fires to then being, the person who starts fires, right? To be rid of certain things. And that's kind of a constant that exists throughout Fahrenheit 51, is this dichotomy between good and bad, and how the same thing can do two different things. Because what we learn is one of the reasons as to why we have all these books that have been removed and people no longer are allowed to read books is because of the contrary development of these two ideas that can be proposed by the same person, right? Of where thoughts and ideas that are not controlled or not, or asked to think about certain difficult things, are inherently contradictory, right? Because there are a million perspectives and viewpoints on everything, right? And so as Beatty, who is the fire chief, eventually ends up describing, is that, right, there's this whole issue of where, because books and literature are contradictory, but then also they provide ideas that go against what is best for humanity, right? They were forcibly removed from society, right? But we also see, as Beatty describes, and as oh boy, what's his name? The professor. I don't remember his name. But as they eventually describe, right, is that it wasn't like it was this immediate process where we just decided we're not going to read books anymore. We're not going to. But it was this slow progression of, because books and literature talk about very difficult things, but also require time to talk about these things, people slowly started moving away from it, right? As is written in 1953, right, we have the major introduction of the television and of the radio and things like that, right? And it's not to say that other forms of media that are in literature, that these other forms of media aren't good, right? I personally love my YouTube and I love watching things. I love my movies when I or television when I care to watch it, right? But what's being described is that there's been this mass exodus of people wanting to read because it talks about uncomfortable things, and it talks about things in that require time to understand it, right? Versus what Gen Z, Gen Alpha, we now describe as brain rot, right? Of where I get to sit down, I get to sit there and scroll on this little tablet or phone that I have and just watch thing after thing after thing, and I don't really have to think about it, right? So yeah, right. So there's this movement away from it already, and then the government basically just steps in and says we're gonna remove all of this anyway, right? Because we have this ongoing issue, right, in which an educated population is a dangerous population for a government, right? Or a government that wants control, right? Inherently, knowledge is power, right? There's the wonderful, wonderful saying, but also you need to be able to act on that knowledge, right? What we see is we have someone like Beatty, who Beatty is the one that goes through it and talks about all of these philosophical arguments, which seems weird because he's also the fire chief, right? He's the one that's supposed to be super gung-ho about putting all these books out, right? And burning all of them. But really, Beatty's the one that is the most informed on literature in terms of everything and all of the novel, right? And I would argue it's because of, like, there's, I guess, first of all, beauty and destruction, but also, you know, going back to this dichotomy, right, of where, you know, Beatty has all of this knowledge, but he can't act on it, right? He has no power to act on it anyway, right? So he just has this stored knowledge of everything and everything and everything that he's ever read, but he can't do anything with it, right? Versus what we see later at the very end of this, when Montag goes and talks to the other survivors and loners that are outside of the city, in which they're the same boat of where they have all this knowledge, but they don't have any power to use it. And instead of succumbing to this frivolous idea that, like, because I have no power, I am worthless, they admit that they have no inherent value right now, but hopefully things will change, right? And it's that matter of perspective and the dichotomy of seeing things in a different light that is super important, right? Because it's not that books just talk about frivolous things that don't matter. It's just that you have to be willing to understand why they matter, right? The whole thing with Clarissa, is that her name? Clarissa? Is that she's constantly asking why, right? And it's it's a thing in which in a modern society that is super focused on getting information, right? Very rarely do we stop to ask why, right? You know, why should I care about this if I can just spend 3 seconds to look it up on a search engine and have an AI tell me what the answer is, right? Why would I care about going through this whole process when I can get the answer in 3 seconds, right? And that's something that we certainly always struggle with, right? It's, you know, as someone who is going into education, right, and had, you know, done my student teaching and also have worked as a substitute, right, is this constant fight, because I want kids to be able to see the why of why this matters. Why do we care that like Elvis refused, or Elvis was drafted into the war, and why Muhammad Ali refused to go, right? Why do we care about these things? Why do they matter, right? Versus the, well, he just did it, so that's the answer, right? So yeah, lots and lots of things about this book. I mean, really, if you wanted to, you could probably do an analysis of each and every page and find something that's important there. Which is one of the reasons I think I really like Ray Bradbury, because there's not a lot of what I feel is wasted words, which is of course ironic, because that's the whole one of the other arguments that gets made here, right? Is that we're so focused on getting to the point that we refuse to quote unquote stop and smell the roses, but like learn to enjoy the journey there, right? You know, I've talked about before with some other authors I didn't particularly enjoy reading, but like there's just not, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of fluff in here, and right, and maybe that's just because part of the fluff that is there comes from a place in understanding that I already have, so it doesn't feel like fluff. But yeah. Bradbury also really pointed in on something that I don't think really got brought up into the past couple years, which is the lack of pedestrian ability in the United States, right? Of where it just seems weird for people to be wanting to just go and walk to places, right? Because America's not built for that. You know, it's a necessity in so many places that you need a car, right? It's even where I'm living, I'm less than a mile away from a grocery store, but if I wanted to go to the grocery store, I would have to walk on the road for at least a mile, for most of it, right? And to get around that, instead of doing that, I take some sidewalks, and then I have to walk through some fields to get to the grocery store without walking on major roads, right? Which is one of those things about like, I'm living in a massive apartment complex where there's one here, there's one right next to me, and there's a major park right next to us. But we can't get to a grocery store without feeling like we're going to be encroached on by cars, right? And you know, I think that's something that's really kind of come to the public eye very recently, within the past probably about 3-4 years, but it's still an incredibly important one, right? That we need this pedestrian safety and pedestrian dignity. But yeah, that is 451 by Ray Bradbury, one of my favorites.